So let's look at hypocrisy and double standards, right? And I think this is a common association that we make. The hypocrite we usually is someone that we think is, applying double standards. I think in ordinary conversation, when we're likely to accuse someone of being a hypocrite, it's like, hey, you're applying this set of standards to that group of people, and then all of a sudden, when you judge this group of people, and the groups are similar or something, you're not really judging like cases like, because you're using one set of standards over here and another set over there, and you should judge them similarly. Sometimes we also accuse someone of being a hypocrite if they judge very different cases alike. But here it's usually double standards, or we're accusing someone of, yeah, you should be employing the same standards in both of these cases, even though the cases might be actually different, but there's an important way in a way that they are the same, and that sameness of these different cases, I think that's not too counterintuitive, like, men, women or something, men and women, there's a difference there, but when we're judging morality, we should not change the standards. That's the key idea, is that the cases might be slightly different or very different, whatever, but in a moral sense, we should keep the same standards, and that's what the hypocrite in this case is not doing. Okay, so let's look a little bit more then at this sort of everyday way of saying hypocrisy and double standards, which, H for hypocrisy, as I usually, H for hypocrisy, and double standards, DS, double standards. Okay, so far, just a quick recap, check out the earlier videos if you haven't had a chance. In most cases, we condemn hypocrisy. We don't like it. Not every case, of course. Check out some of the earlier videos, like the hypocritical fundraiser, for instance, talking up rich guy and maybe making rich guy think you're kind of okay with some of his unsavory beliefs in order to get more money, and it's for a good cause, blah, blah, blah. Maybe even you have a right or maybe even a duty to be hypocritical in some cases, right? So we made that, it's not entirely unreasonable to make that case. It may not work, but it's not entirely irrational or unreasonable to say, hey, look, I can mount an argument for it. Fine. And we also saw that hypocrisy always involves some kind of gap between the inner and outer self. Some kind of, private me, public me, personal me, public me kind of thing. Let's think about another gap, and that's with double standards. Another gap is there's a gap. There seems to be a gap here, like, between what's applying over here, there's a gap, and then something new appears in terms of standards over here. So like, hey, how come the standards don't move across? No, there's something here. There's a gap between the standards over here and the standards and the new standards over here, or vice versa, however you want. But there is some sort of disconnect and applying different standards. And so in one way, it's like, hey, well, what applies to me, the typical hypocrite, well, what applies to me is different than what applies to you. That's often the case where we say, you're being a real hypocrite. Yeah, you have one set of standards for yourself and a set of standards for everyone else, right? And we usually know, who gets the favorable standards. Well, if we recall, a couple of videos ago, I looked at the Gospel of Matthew, did a little bit on that. There's lots. Jesus, really kind of takes the boots to the hypocrites, and the criticism was of different standards. That seems to be quite common. Aquinas worries about hypocrites as people of double standards, and that's in another video. But basically, the double standards, like the Pharisees, they have standard 1 for them and standard 2, basically again just different standards for others. And hey, that's the hypocrite. And again, the analysis of Matthew can be quite complicated, but that's one of the main thrusts of the of that discussion that Jesus has, with the Pharisees. And so that's kind of at the root of the judge not, lest ye be judged, blah, blah, blah. What's going on there? Well, basically, don't do this. Right? You should have, if you have a standard for others, then you should get ready to have that standard applied to you as well. So be prepared to be judged by the same standards that you apply to others, and it should be the same. Okay? Now, let's back up a little bit. We can make the case that double standards, just purely double standards, are not always bad. Not necessarily bad. They can be, but they don't have to be automatically. So just simply saying, you've employed double standards, that's a sufficient condition for calling you a hypocrite. No, it might be a necessary condition, maybe, but it certainly isn't sufficient because we do use double standards all the time. That's how we navigate a lot of life, and it's not necessarily bad. Well, here's an example. Like you're a parent, so you got some kids, and you're also a person with some friends. Well, you're going to have different ways of judging your children. You know, you're going to have certain standards that they should live up to, and certain standards that you may, have with your friends. And you don't judge them all by the same standards, right? I judge my kids in certain ways. They're kids, right? I can't expect everything. Here's the thing. And that's the root of it. This basic intuition that we have that seems to be grounded in practices and embedded in laws is that we don't expect the same thing out of children that we do out of adults, right? We have different laws that govern them. Why is that? Well, we would say that we have to have different standards. There is a difference here, and it's justifiable, right? They're all human beings. They all have rights. Yeah, that's fine. But little children, if they get into trouble, we don't quite hold them to the same standards that we hold adults. But once you cross a threshold, once you get to a certain age, and you keep let's say if you're stealing when you're a kid, you'll get treated in a certain way. But once you get to a certain age, then other standards will kick in, and the measures will be more punitive, right? So we would say we'll judge children by one set, and you certainly would judge other adults by another, because we do say to other adults, you should know better than that. You're not a kid. Stop acting like a kid, right? You can't get away with stuff like that. With kids, it's not so much getting away with. It's just those standards don't really apply, right? Certain legal standards that are ultimately grounded in this intuition of different standards may not apply. So they're not getting away with it. Whereas we do say to an adult, you can't get away with stuff like that because the standards do apply to you. So basically, again, just simple double standards alone is not sufficient to say someone's being hypocritical. Like you wouldn't say that of a parent, you're being a big hypocrite because you expect more out of your older kids than your younger kids. That's not being a hypocrite, even though you are employing double standards. So when do double standards lead us into territory where we would say, okay, now we're going to bring up the blame here. Like now there's something that's gone awry here. Well, let's do a little thought experiment. 19th century guy, has double standards with men and women. And, and clearly, then let's say, men can do certain jobs that women can't. And just applies these standards. Like, yeah, I hire this, I don't hire women, I only hire men, etc., etc. Something like that. But you say to the 19th century guy, hey, you shouldn't do that. And he goes, yeah, I think it's fine. And let's say you have a discussion and this person is totally open about the double standards. It's like, yeah, there's double standards, kind of like the way, you have double standards like I talked about with parents, right? And we would say, wait a second, you shouldn't have double standards in this case because that's a kind of paternalism that's misguided or unjustified. And so that is an example of these double standards that have gone wrong. We would say those are wrong. You're even though you're open about it and all that, you're not trying to hide it. We might say, 19th century guy, you're not really being a hypocrite, but you definitely are being, sexist. Is that all it is? Would we say something else? Would we say the hypocrite or just being sexist? Certainly, we would, make the case like, yeah, you're being sexist with those double standards. Like, what are you doing? But we might not say hypocrite because we might say something like, you're just flat wrong in this, right? You think you're right, but you're just flat wrong, and you're being sexist, and you need some education or whatever. Okay, so that's probably where we would say something like that. We might not say hypocrite. Some people might, but I think it's probably more just like this case, it's a sexist case. But imagine we have 21st century guy who imports these 19th century guys' double standards and applies them, but tries to hide them. Still believes in all of them like 19th century guy does, but he's trying to hide them, right? So again, he's importing the 19th century guy's double standards. He tries to hide them, even though he applies them. Well, we would still say, yeah, this is 21st century guy is a sexist person too. But I think in this case, we would now say, the double standards here, as opposed to here, lead us to say hypocrite. So it's not the case, sort of the upshot It's not the case that double standards are necessarily wrong. In some cases, we might say they're justifiable. And with children of different ages or whatever, you might say, oh, not we have multiple standards, right? I'm going to judge a 4-year-old differently by different standards than a 9-year-old, different standards than a 14-year-old, 18-year-old, et cetera, et cetera. And where parents may run into trouble is where if they don't, let's say, have different standards. Like if you say to a 5-year-old, I'm going to treat you like you're 20, that's not really a good idea, right? Is say, yeah, you can make up your own mind about your career right now. You don't like school, well then quit. I don't think that would be terribly responsible if a parent said that. But if it's a 20-year-old wanting to drop out of university or something like that, you might say, well, you're 20. It's up to you to decide what kind of education you like. So there's a double. There's different standards there, and not applying a double standard would be lend someone to I think very legitimate criticism. Okay, so the notion of double standards, it can be independent of whether something is blameworthy, right? And sometimes we'd even say you have a duty to apply, as a parent, to apply double standards, multiple standards, and that's why parenting can be, shall we say, kind of complicated. So in this, but back to 21st century guy, we would say, yeah, you're a sexist hypocrite. So the upshot of this is going to look something like, what's the link between hypocrisy and, double standards? Double standards. When there is, it seems to be when there's some kind of an attempt to hide the double standards, right? It's like it's like maybe trying to appear that, to people that you don't have those double standards, even though you're putting them into practice, but you're trying to get people to think that you don't have the double standards. Now, that is that linking of trying to get people to think that you don't have something that you have, like you don't have a double standard when in fact you have it, is what's sometimes called dissimulation, or to dissimulate, right? Simulate means in a way you would try to let people think that you have something that you don't have. Dissimulate is to try and get people to think that you don't have some view, double standards, that you in fact do have. And as a matter of fact, linking hypocrisy and double standards in this way, when there is an attempt to hide. So the dissimulation of your double standards, that makes you into a hypocrite, links up to Matthew and Jesus' criticism. And in another video, I talk about how this is pretty well how Aquinas sees the notion of hypocrisy. But that's a story for another video. See you later.